Not quite simultaneously, straight opposite, in 1939, the Partisan Review published Clement Greenberg's now classic essay, Avant-Garde and Kitsch. At this stage of his career, like many other leftist intellectuals confronting the reality of Stalinism, Greenberg began to modify his socialist convictions in line with Trotsky and the emerging neoconservative views that would gradually come to dominate the review in the 1950s. In any event, Avant-Garde and Kitsch, Greenberg's first major piece of published criticism, appeared more or less at the center of that arc. It was during the brief and politically charged years of 1939 and 1940 that the essence of his legacy can begin to be identified. In these years, Greenberg's political feet remained firmly on the left, and like Benjamin, he was a fervent and outspoken anti-capitalist. Greenberg's major contribution to modernist art theory, for our present purpose, can be summarized in the briefest possible terms as follows. The defense of an elite culture against the corruption of popular taste, and the axiom that an artistic medium should be pursued and evaluated according to the dictates of its own structural imperatives. Most famously, the proposition that painting needed to acknowledge the flatness of its surface and the restrictions of the frame. These two premises, the maintenance of the free practice of high art and the pursuit of the integrity to medium, served perfectly as justifications for abstraction, Greenberg's main cause as a critic and defender of American modernism. Both principles also served as an argument for a disinterested aesthetics that divorced art from politics, which is to say, all content external to itself. This presents us an odd picture, as if suddenly Greenberg, performing as Kant, were to walk into the room wearing Marx's greatcoat and sporting a massive white beard to announce that the eventual triumph of socialism was at hand, but for the sake of its own survival, the fine arts should keep to themselves. The story of the depoliticization of post-war American modernism has been debated often and cannot be rehearsed here. Suffice it to say that a choice was on offer regarding how art should be approached and interpreted in both scholarly and public settings. It is certainly the case that Greenberg, like Benjamin, thought about art in its socio-political setting, even as they came to radically different conclusions. In the end, Greenberg seemed to be a kind of isolationist who saw the fragility of high culture and sought its protection rather than enlisting its influence. He encouraged a retreat into self-containment, and in doing so, he also provided a theoretical undergirding for the separation of curatorial responsibilities. Our current division by medium is not Greenberg's doing, but it can claim his ideas as theoretical support even so. As far as I am aware, even though, as far as I am aware, he never wrote a word about a print. I'm sure he did someplace, but I can't find it. Retrospectively, studies of the media from the mid to late 20th century bore a lot of intellectual weight. They took on the popular press, political caricature, advertisement, technical illustration, and even ephemera, making a good case for having laid the groundwork for what we now refer to as visual culture, along with its European counterpart, Bildwissenschaft. Print studies were once again actively stirring up the historical landscape. Instrumental to this development in our country was, of course, William Ivins, the first curator of the print department at the Met in the days when it was still called a print department. However much we might disagree with various of Ivins' often provocative observations, there is no doubt that it was he who made the subject intellectually gripping, at least for those of us who have worked seriously on prints over the last several decades. In many ways, he is our local hero. Ivins' best-known proposition arose out of his interest in scientific and technological progress. By any measure, an overwhelming factor in America's self-image between and after the two world wars when Ivins was writing. He made accessible the argument that having the same image of the same object or device simultaneously in the hands of many people in different places was essential to technological advance. That simple proposition, ultimately descending from John Evelyn, and Ivan's concept of pictorial syntax, together anticipated by a decade Marshall McLuhan's famous dictum, "The medium is the message." Ivan's book, Prints in Visual Communication, also had an influence on the emergence of information theory, somewhat of a vogue before and after the advent of private computers. Ivan's was interested in replication as knowledge. The second important proposition that emerged with particular force in the 70s and 80s was a claim for the agency of the early press in the propagation of social and religious movements. I refer to the origins of pictorial propaganda and popular teaching during the decisive years of the early Reformation and the Peasants' War in Northern Europe, a case made most forcefully by Marxist scholars led by the Australian historian Robert Scribner, along with certain writers in the former German Democratic Republic. Their arguments had precedent in the work done by European scholars on newsprint and printed propaganda after World War I. So we're seeing continuities running through this story. The most sweeping thesis to be put forward in recent years regarding the impact of the printed image on Western culture is Christopher Wood's book, Forgery, Replica, and Fiction, published in 2008. It is an assessment of the printed image and its impact on our conception of historical time and space, addressing the various ways in which material evidence of the past was portrayed and understood prior to the establishment of precise historical chronologies. In this pre-Renaissance state of affairs, ancient monuments were invoked by mere approximations of an imagined type, a scheme Wood calls substitutability. Then, with the proliferation of images through printing, a kind of verification came into play, where printed images sought to portray the physical singularity of things, thereby making possible a new understanding of history as a coherent sequence of material events by identifiable points in a chain, in effect, a modern conception of history. This objectification of the past, consistent with an emerging secular worldview, demystified the object by making it familiar, and thus mundane. In this thesis, we can see strains of Benjamin's notion of the loss of aura, and also Ivan's thinking about what he called the exactly repeatable pictorial statement. Wood's thesis grants extraordinary power to the printed image in bringing about a shift in cultural mentalities, at least so far as the perception of historical time is concerned. Yet he also introduces a kind of deconstruction of this vector in the activities of artists who make a subjective claim to their own intellectual property. Signing a replicated image makes it individual and thus dissolves the objectivity that had putatively been gained by disseminating information as verifiable fact. Two different intentions, two different results. But are they in fact contradictory? One might respond by saying that in both categories, the reproduced image implies the validation of a witness whose evidence is made subject to disapproval in the first case and to disapproval in the second. That is to say, we can make our judgment about the qualities of a work of art on our own, whereas in the first, the image provides evidence which can then be weighed in the balance. So where are we? So much for background. I'll now get myself into more serious trouble by returning to my exchange with the Print Council. For this, I apologize to my fellow members who may be in the audience, as indeed they are. What comes next is primarily addressed to curators, but the implications, I hope, are relevant to all. I hear the locution, "I am a print person," often, but I never hear, "I am a paintings person." Why is that? What I often said to my interns was that they should think of themselves not as committed to works of art made in a particular medium, but rather as art historians with an interest in such things. Although one can say the distinction is purely rhetorical, there is nevertheless an attitude underlying the emphasis on medium, one that I believe tends to be limiting rather than inclusive. Another thing I've noticed is an inclination, not only among students, but also among curators in other fields, to believe that there is something inherently mysterious about dealing with prints, an intimation that they have not been let in on the handshake. I've been approached on a few occasions by recent graduates seeking a museum career who felt that they, quote, didn't understand prints and wanted to learn more about a field that they openly regarded as obscure. Again, would one expect to hear such a confession about paintings, whether true or not? I think we have been a little guilty of encouraging this perception, or at least not actively discouraging it. When I entered the field of art history as a graduate student, works on paper were something that one took an interest in mainly in order to find out something else. What Raphael used for source material, how designs got transmitted across the Alps, how popular a particular saint's cult might have been, why Degas cropped his compositions the way he did. Almost nobody wrote dissertations on prints, not least because so much of what had been written about them was restricted to catalogs raisonnés and sections of monographs focused on more important subjects. Now the situation is very different. There are dissertations aplenty, as well as exhibitions exploring all manner of historical, social, cultural, economic, and political topics through works on paper, along with monographic and thematic installations of the familiar sort. And the insertion of works on paper into displays of other kinds of objects has become in common practice in museums, despite the conservational difficulties with the additional labor involved. The difference is that in a variety of ways, works on paper have been steadily integrated into the larger history of art. However historicized the works we have been considering from the 1930s and 1960s, that kind of integration was actually not happening. However obvious this may seem, it is a development that is crucially important for how curators understand their role in museums and in the academy. Prints have found their way into every corner of the pictorial and plastic arts and can be understood as one binding medium in the history of Western art from the early modern period to the present. And meanwhile, in the larger world of postmodern artistic production, discrimination by medium has become nearly incidental. Witness the materials line on a wall label for a Robert Rauschenberg combine. Making the history of prints a part of the history of post-medieval art in general has been the task of the last generation. The founding of an organization such as this, one that defines itself according to the boundaries of a medium, must reflect with special care on the assumptions that underlie this way of parsing cultural history. One must ask oneself why no such organization exists for painting and sculpture, although comparable ones do exist for the history of the book and the history of film. In short, those domains that have no history of academies to support them. Should we be concerned about the fact that the various mediums of replication, those with a history of collusion with the popular arts, those that have come last in the hierarchical ordering of artistic practices, those with the taint of secondariness about them, indeed those with a subtle inferiority complex, or perhaps even a superiority complex, now find the need to organize a union? Is this a progressive or a reactionary move? That is my question for you, and of course the answer is, it depends on how you do it. Perhaps it is unfair to charge curators with having helped to ghettoize prints as a medium. There is a marked satisfaction in belonging to those who love prints, and not those who would rather look at the things everybody else looks at. The appeal of it is genuine and infectious. I've experienced it myself, and in fact have deployed the argument that institutions should not hold print shows to the same expectations for viewership that more mainstream productions are expected to attain, that prints are typically small things and require close attention, and otherwise may as well be ignored altogether, and thus that they are mounted with the expectation of a more exclusive audience, a more patient audience, even a more informed audience, and therefore an audience that can be expected to gain more from the experience. But a limited number of viewers is not a reason to construct a limited menu of exhibition topics. That should be determined by the interest of the curator and in those historical problems that are most compelling and most accessible through the works available to show. But here, any significant print collection already has in-house a much greater range of historical possibility than is likely to be found in their collections of paintings and sculpture. It is simply a matter of numbers. Therefore, if it is the case that print exhibitions are often dull, it is not the fault of the medium itself, but rather how the medium is interpreted. And I might just say as an aside that in the last 2 days, having spent a bit of time at the Met and also at MoMA, that were I to have that as my sample of what is going on in the world of the media and its relationship to everything else, I would have thrown the lecture into the trash. But I think that what I've been looking at is not exemplary. We are now at a crossroads in the museum profession, or should I say, yet another crossroads, one that involves constant fighting for resources, a resistance to lowering the bar on scholarship, and by extension, on what we are able to require of the public. To a lesser extent than the Academy, we are under pressure to offer more entertainment, although it would be a mistake to say that the professoriate is not experiencing similar pressures. But there is embedded in these circumstances an appeal that has virtue and that is an encouragement to expand our range of thinking, to cross boundaries, and to be more inclusive. Breaking down the curatorial boxes is only one tactic for doing this, but it may be the most important one. Greenberg's proposition about the integrity to medium did not stand alone. The simultaneous practice of new criticism loomed behind it. New criticism likewise extolled self-referentiality as the objective of modern art, indeed art in general. The impact of these analytical strategies was profound in American higher education from the 50s well into the 70s, and I think it's fair to say that pedagogy in the humanities is still deeply immersed in close reading as a strategy for approaching the significance of a text or a work of art. It is an unsurpassed means of providing students with a vocabulary for looking, and was certainly a constant in my own teaching. But in principle, all this is meant to be preliminary to establishing an acquaintance with a work of art in order to talk about it in some larger sphere. Material factors have long been a standard basis for curatorial alignments, although its legitimacy as a reflection of historical reality and actual artistic affinity is flimsy at best. Specialization by medium descends primarily from the traditional preferences of collectors to take an interest in particular types of objects, an emotional rather than an historical factor, and one that seems to have been unusually important for collectors of works on paper. The preferences of collectors is an extremely interesting topic itself, and certainly does merit investigation as a problem in the history of taste. But this does not mean make it an ideal model for the organization of things. Special knowledge of a medium is essentially a post hoc rationale for a scheme that was already in place by the 17th century, long before curatorial staffs became necessary components of a museum, and art history departments necessary components of a university. In fact, there is no inherent or essential reason why curatorial assignments should adopt this arrangement as their primary model, knowledge of materials and techniques notwithstanding. It is simply one solution out of several. Art historians are trained first in a period and a geographical area, not in a medium. They acquire certain languages and not others as a result of this, and they are expected to understand the history and culture of a time and place, whether it be Southern Europe, 19th century England, or Edo Japan, in a spectrum of different ways and with considerable thoroughness. In short, we've been taught to be cultural historians with a specialized interest in objects, not the other way around. There's every reason to respect the collector's devotion to a particular medium, whether it be glass, prints, or shoes, each of them represented by museums in one place or another. But the art historian's task in writing about objects or in taking charge of them as a custodian is to return them to the larger context of their history. The practice of art history should ultimately be one of reintegration, not parceling out. Indeed, the recent developments in professional art history all support not just an integrated approach to the study of objects, but an expanding field of materials and things, especially the culture we now loosely refer to as the media. One could reasonably argue that in such a universe, a primary concern of art history should be the defense of its traditional boundaries. What constitutes a work of art? Where should the limits of the public collection begin and where should they end? What sorts of things are legitimate topics of study? We must acknowledge that these boundaries have, for evident cultural reasons, become much harder to discern, and the old arguments for doing art history by medium are therefore less persuasive. One thing we can say, however, is that knowledge of the replicated image and its intricate and widely implicated history is a very rich basis for centripetal thinking. When I began writing this essay, I was bent on composing a sermon about the perils of dividing up the history of art according to medium. I still hold to that original position, and for reasons that, at least in my understanding, have to do with where we are now in our thinking about our mutual field of interest. But as I went along, I found myself talking more and more about the ways in which prints have, for entirely credible reasons, been granted special status almost since the beginning of the art form. Nonetheless, it seems to me that as the second international organization with serious interest in this subject, you have an enhanced obligation to consider your ambitions widely. We are in an age of cross-disciplinary thinking, and if the discussion of the media, Facebook included, is anything to go by, the replicated visual utterance sits right at the center of it all. This comports with a long-standing disposition in the history of printed matter to be the most sensitive among the arts to respond broadly to its environment, and accordingly the most resistant to Kantian appeals for disinterestedness. The history of the replicated image is one of engagement, not exclusivity. That may sound absurdly grandiose, but what I mean by it is modestly pragmatic. Art historians in the academy, at least those concerned with the post-medieval era, now recognize an obligation to take into account the replicated image as a forceful dimension of their field. This is the case not just for Europe, but also for Central and South Asia as well. Meanwhile, down the block, the museums go about. Meanwhile, down the block, amongst the museums, much is being said about the decreasing authority and effectiveness of curatorial staffs, the redistribution of their traditional responsibilities, and the diminishment of their ranks. The only way to respond to these developments where they occur, and they are occurring, is to cross the boundaries of medium and find a common cause with one's fellow art historians, both curators and academics alike, and take back the museum as a place for serious art history. This group could be the perfect forum for helping to further that cause, and in that, I wish you the best. Thank you. Sorry for the somewhat rocky delivery. I had trouble seeing my paper. I think people are very short here for some reason. Anyway. Yeah, sure, of course.
We'll take a few questions. If you can make it to the the microphone in the center aisle. This is being recorded, so we'd love to capture what the questions are. Thank you.
Ah, there she is. Yes. Okay.
Peter and I have already discussed what I think about print curators.
I can hear you fine.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. But my question, actually, I would say one thing. I was sitting next to someone who calls herself a paintings person, just for the record. But my question is, you are the author of a rather traditional book about the medium of printmaking. So I wonder now, and you wrote that some time ago with David Landau, and I was wondering how you see that book now in terms of what you've just been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair, certainly a fair question. Well, first, I require to be allowed to have my ideas evolve. Not necessarily change, though, not necessarily change. When David and I set out to write that book, our intention was precisely to lift the print out in a way that would reintegrate it into the, or actually integrate it into the full narrative of Renaissance art. Our view was that it had been systematically neglected, or at least suppressed as far as its central importance to the phenomenon of the Renaissance was concerned. And it was precisely for that reason that we took a very wide-ranging view of it and focused on case studies and talked a great deal about problems of reception, as well as technical issues about how things arose and so forth. We saw that book precisely as a way of attaching it to the larger history, not creating an exclusive story involving drawings, paintings, and so forth, seriously engaging the issue of color. Meanwhile, there was a coherent kind of story that needed to be told about the Renaissance print broadly in and of itself, and of course that's also what we did. But the intent was exactly to get it into the story, and I think it did. I think it did. I think the numbers of dissertations and so on that followed in the wake of that book were a reflection of the fact that people thought, oh yeah, this is not such a great mystery that we can't enter into, and in fact it's a rather complex and interesting domain, and one should do more with it. But it's true, it's a study of prints, yeah, as a lot of what I've done, including my catalogs. And just to say one more thing, all the reasons why there should be print curators, I totally agree with. Just to get that on the table. Anyway, but it's not a problem that the Met has, or ever will have, so I'm not worried about the Met either. Anyway, yes.
Thank you for this great provoking lecture. I think one of the ways although it's called Print Scholars Association, one of the ways this association is inclusive already in the way that you suggest we should be, is because we include not only print scholars, but actually print makers. And as you have said, the printmaking has evolved to include all kinds of media and combining media. And so in that way, through the exchange of printmakers, print collectors who maybe not only collect prints anymore, it is becoming inclusive in that way, I hope, at least. So.
Yeah, it depends on how it evolves, and I think that I'm not sure exactly what kinds of things will happen, but my impression is that this is really an organization about hosting symposia and lectures and talking, which is absolutely the right way to go about it, and perhaps actually subventing things from time to time. One thing about, of course, it's a good idea to involve people who understand how things are made. I was talking to a colleague of mine who's a museum director recently, and he asked me what I was going to talk about, and I told him, and he said, well, the one thing you can say about print curators, and he's speaking for himself, is that, they can always give you a precise and lucid account of what a dry point is, And you can't expect to find that in 90% of the people who curate sculpture. I don't know. I'm not going to tell you who said that, but there's a funny way in which in which that's true. In other words, our obsession with technique has borne fruit, but it also can be a limitation. I mean, it's something that everybody should know more about. That's just basic. But beyond that, to kind of depend on it. So, for example, I frequently had to wrestle with the education department of the National Gallery not to put a technical section into my exhibitions when I didn't want one. I don't have a blanket objection to that, but I dealt with that when I had exhibitions primarily by evolving it through short wall text so that people learned it by looking rather than were programmed at the beginning. And that's just an example. And I think looking back, for example, on photography criticism, one of the things you would find is that when photography first started to establish its bona fides back in the 50s and 60s as a discipline that could have a kind of critical net behind it, a critical debate behind it, there was heavy dependence on technical issues when you evaluated photography. Their aesthetics were deeply embedded in technical matters. And it's exactly that sort of needs to be gotten over. I mean, one understands that, but it, again, is part of centrifugal thinking rather than centripetal thinking.
Maybe I misspoke a bit. I should have said artists rather than printmakers, because when I was at the reception a while ago at CAA, I think, of the APS, the people I talked with, there were artists, and they were mostly making monoprints or otherwise using techniques were related to printing, but not per se a replicable print, so painting over stuff. And so in that way, we already will expand beyond the traditional printmaking, I think.
Yeah. Yes, and I think this is very evident in the most current thinking in museums. And I refer again to what I've seen in the last 2 days just going on at MoMA and at the Met. The media are present everywhere, and I'm talking about mixtures of things, film and photography and printed media, and painting and sculpture and so forth. All those kinds of boundaries that are defined by curatorial practice are gone. They're just not there. But I also think this is being led by modernists, as it should be, and they, to me, have always been the people that you needed to pay attention to, in museums especially, what they were doing. And modernists, modern departments in museums conventionally do not divide themselves up by medium, unless there's a huge critical mass involved.
Thank you.
Okay, we can talk over whatever is upstairs.
Thank you so much. And again, hope you'll join us upstairs for a reception afterwards.